So let's create our own stack. So I'm going to go back to custom style. Okay. And the first thing we've been talking about is the ray trace engine. So I'm going to go over to ray tracing. And what's nice about this is you can actually go by category, right? So we've got, lighting effects, architectural effects, that's at 2 point, or you can actually search. So if I search for ray, we'll see ray tracing here. So I'll click this, and that's going to switch the engine over to ray trace mode. And what this is asking for is samples and bounces. Basically, the higher the numbers, the higher the quality, but the longer it'll take to render, okay? Generally, I keep this around 100 plus, and you'll notice if you change the preset, you'll kind of see that happening automatically, right? So they're automatically moving these up. So samples, it's basically the amount of passes they'll do to refine the image. I think 256 is way too high. It's just like it takes way too much time to render out, but the quality is nice. Bounces, this is going to calculate how many times the light bounces off of a surface. This can go on infinitely, so it's good to cap it. 7 is totally fine, but I'll lower this just a little bit to 128, just so we can do draft renders. If we want more realistic renders, we can easily go back and improve this. So I've done that. I'm going to add in real skies, right? Because we want realistic lighting. So I'm going to grab that, and I'm going to find an HDRI that looks great. So I personally like these cloudy ones just because it adds some detail up here, and it helps soften up the light a little bit. Okay, so it looks a little gloomy, so let's find something a little brighter. Let's go with this. Okay, and the trick is I want the light to be coming from here. That way this side is illuminated and there's not too many shadows on our building. So I like this. I like that I'm getting some shade from here, right? It's adding some interest here. And I'm just going to increase the sky brightness a little bit. So if I do this, it's going to look way too overexposed. So that's what that is. And the sun intensity, that's the actual sunlight on the house. Okay, and I think I just want to lower the camera just a little bit. Okay, and I'm going to hold shift and just bring this in a bit. Perfect. I'm going to start the camera. Okay, and we can also revisit our glass to tweak. Remember earlier on, we said we'd look at it once we get like the vegetation and the lighting. This is kind of the time that I'd typically revisit that. So I'm going to go back. And just so you can see what can happen is this is the preview, right? If you remember early on when we set up our settings, it asked if we wanted to automatically update the preview, but I said I'd rather wait. So notice how once I clicked in it, it's generating a preview, right? So it's going to make the rendering right here. So this is going to kind of slow things down because it is rendering. So that's why I do like to kind of have the ability to choose. So what I could see from the preview is the glass needs a lot of work. We should make it a little bit more reflective. So I'm just going to go back to build mode. Okay, I'm going to zoom in and let's fix this. Okay, and I'm going to go double click. Okay, and let's boost our reflectivity just to be a little bit higher and brighter. Perfect. Yeah, we could see the clouds there. Okay. Raise the transparency a bit. Lower the distortion. We can lower some of the frostiness. See the difference? So I'll leave that around there. Perfect. And now let's switch back to our render. Okay, I'm going to click here. Yeah, there we go. So now we're getting the reflections. So there's something weird going on here, right? We've got some odd blue here, and it looks like our glass is a little too wavy, right? So let's go in and let's see what's going on. Going to lower the distortion a bit and lower the relief. Okay. So what's going on? Let's see. Doesn't look like it. Let me turn off double-sided for now. Let's go back. Okay, cool. Yeah, that seemed to fix it. So we had modeled thickness on that glass. So we didn't need that. It looked like it was creating an issue where it's kind of bouncing between itself. So let's just do a test render, right? So to do that, you're going to hit render photo right here. And now it's going to ask you for the size. Typically, I use desktop just because most of the images I'm sending are like are in emails, or they're going into like small little booklets. This is totally fine. For larger images, let's say like a poster, I would do print and above. So I'm going to do desktop. And I'm going to save this on my hard drive just as a test. I'll call this draft01. And I'll save this. As you can see, it's going to spend some time and it's going to render. We're doing about a minute based on 128 samples. So you could see like the passes here, right? And it's slowly refining. So while it's doing this, I like to kind of look at the image and think about how we can improve it, right? So a couple of things I want to do is we can add, like a fog in the backdrop just to add some more depth. We can add depth of field. That way we can focus on the building a little bit more. I think these plants are a little bit too neon, so we can kind of tweak the coloring there. And I want to make the image a little bit brighter. And I think we could also add some more weathering to our materials here, right? Okay. And this is an iterative process, so we're not going to get it done on the first go. So I'm going to hit OK. And let's go back to build mode. Okay. And go over here and let's add some more weathering. So I'm going to visit all these. And let's go to weathering. Increase this just a little bit, just so there's some slight discoloration and it comes through. Same thing here. So we didn't have any weathering here. So let's do that. That's going to add some shading in here. Be a little too much. Just a little bit. Do the same thing to our trim. A little bit more. Okay. All right, cool. We'll do the same thing here. Perfect. All right, so I was talking about these plants here, how they're a little too bright. So I'm going to go to content library, make sure I'm on nature mode, select these guys. I'm going to do select all identical objects. So all of them are picked up. And now let's start tweaking these. I'm going to lower this a little bit. And then I'm also going to play with this. I'm going to add just a little bit of green. I think that's going to help with some of the yellow in there. Okay, and let's go back to render mode. Okay, and let's play with the brightness. So that is coming from a little bit of here and the fact that we don't have any color correction or exposure settings, right? And that's actually going to help us a lot here. So if I go back to FX and I go over to camera, we've got our depth of field. So I'm going to add that real quick. I'm going to go back, add another effect, and let's find our exposure. I can just search here and let's find our color correction settings. Okay. And this might look crazy, but basically we've got some light settings that we can improve. So we don't even need to go into Photoshop. So you could, cheat and add some exposure here to add some brightness to the image or increase the sunlight itself. So just pointing that out. So I'm going to leave that at 0 for now, and we'll get back to that, but I'll disable this. The depth of field, if I go over here, if you're unfamiliar with what that is let me show you an example. So I'm going to go up to here, okay, just so we've got some trees here. And I'm going to turn on autofocus and then edit. This is going to ask me, what do you want to focus on? I want to focus on the building, right? So I'll hit check mark. And now when I increase the amount of blur, see what's happening to the trees here? See how they're blurring, right? So if you think of it like any portrait shots that you've seen, the background's always blurred. So that's what this is doing. And it's going to blur that out as well. So I could bring the camera back a little bit and I could frame it in a way where I've got this in the top. So kind of like this. I'm going to lower the amount because it's way too much. And I'm going to save that. Pretty happy about this. And the autofocus is really nice because you usually have to play with focus distance, which is kind of frustrating. So I do like that we have that as an option. Okay. And now let's also add some fog. Okay. Now fog you have to be careful about because if I add too much, see that? Just looks a little crazy. You can see I can play with the fall off so it doesn't go up there. But we just want a little bit, right? So I'm going to lower the density just so we see a little in the background. Okay, and you can also increase the brightness here. Right? Just a hair, okay? And I'm just going to let that think. Yeah, so you see how we're kind of seeing this be a little blurred out. The trees are being blurred, but we're also seeing this kind of fade out in the background, which is great. So again, let's go back to the brightness settings of our real skies, okay? And let's play with the sun intensity. Make it a little bit brighter. And our sky brightness. Okay. A little bit of that. And the background, yeah, you see what's happening here? We don't want it to be too bright where it just like blows out our windows. But this is looking better. I'm pretty happy with this. I like that we're getting the shadow cast here. It's great. And now I'm going to go over to color correction. You really want your lighting to do a lot of the work first and then go in. So here we've got our exposure settings. If I have it auto exposed, see what it's going to do? It's going to do a lot of that lifting for us so we don't need to calculate it, but I'm just going to increase it somewhere around there, right? Okay. And you can see the weathering's coming through nicely. Here we can play with the temperature. So this is, warmer or cooler. We'll make it a little warm. Tint, I don't recommend playing with. Contrast, adding contrast to the image. I think in general, more realistic images have kind of like a cinematic kind of look, which comes from your contrast. The highlights, so this is how bright the whites are. You see that? So that's somewhere around there. Midtones, say, we can leave that. It really depends on the focus, right? We want our building to shine, so I might lower those just a bit. Shadows, right? How dark or light our shadows are. Fine bringing them down a bit. The gamma, which is overall brightness, right? Bring that somewhere in there. And saturation and vibrancy, right? So check this out. So if I increase the saturation, it's going to get super green. I actually like to lower the saturation a bit, right? Because in the real world, we don't have these like crazy vivid colors. That's going to help with the yellow. And I actually kind of counteract it a little bit with vibrancy, right? So if I make saturation 100%, you can see what's going on, right? It's adding a lot of color up here. So I'm going to go a little bit here, go a little bit there, but not too far. Otherwise it just dulls the whole image. Okay, let's click this. But you can see, in just like a couple minutes, like the difference that we've done by adding the depth of field, the weathering, we changed the lighting settings and everything. So what other things can we do? I don't like how much greenery or how much grass I have here. So I have two options. Either I can add, some more plants here or more details, or I can just zoom in my focal length. So I might do that just so there's less of that. Okay. Do something like that and then save that. Okay, perfect. That's looking great. We've got our fog working. We've got this. Maybe I lower the weathering a little bit on the roof and then add some more to the shingle. And then maybe add a little bit more to the vinyl siding, right? So we've got a couple options here. I can also lower the blur a bit, but you can see this is really iterative. It's like once you think you're in a good spot, you revisit it and you think it makes more sense to tweak. Nothing wrong with that, right? So I'm going to go back to build mode. Okay, let's lower this a bit. Okay, and then what do we got here? Let's all make this the same, around 8. Okay, this I'll boost a little bit. Okay, yeah, that's way too much, right? And let's play with some of the colors here. Yeah, we'll leave that there at like 20-ish. Cool. All right, awesome. All right, let's add some more effects. Okay, yeah, this is looking great. And let's just do a little preview. Yeah, we've got that there. Okay, awesome. All right, let's add some more effects. Personally, I like to add a little bit of bloom. So watch this. If you're unfamiliar with what bloom is, watch this. It's basically going to add a little bit of a glow. And I know I said a little bit and then this happened, but it was that one. I like to have just a little. Okay, not too much. But I think right around there, it's totally fine. Okay, great. That's looking good. Let's add some more effects. We'll go back up here. And if you find that you like the same effects and you want to reuse it, you can actually save these out. You can copy, and then you can also save to your hard drive, which is really nice. This is actually what I wind up doing to make production a little bit faster, because I don't need to do this for every single job. Like, I know which settings I like, right? So keep that in mind. Let's go back to add. Let's add a little bit of a sharpen. I don't like going too crazy. Just like 30 is totally fine. Let's go back. All right. Vignette, if you're unfamiliar with what that is, that's going to add this black in the corners. I don't like too much, but we've got two things going on. The softness, right? How hard it is and how soft it is. I think a little bit is nice. I wouldn't go too extreme. Like, this is nuts, right? Just a little bit. It's all about being subtle, right? Okay, we're going to keep going through. And again, these are all artistic options, right? I could be doing this in Photoshop, but if I can save a step and I don't need to go to another piece of software, that's huge. Color Lab, think of these as like, I call them like Instagram filters, but watch what happens. So these are all different presets. They're also similar to lookup tables if you come from the photography world. I actually like having a little bit of them. I think they add some nice color, but this is total preference. I might leave this at 30% on the default option. Okay, and I'm just going through. I don't need these. Conceptual, this is good for like early on. If I have a client that wants to be a little bit more collaborative and they want to see the work being done, or, they have questions about like the camera and the light and all that, sometimes I'll do these sketchy options. And if I click that, it's going to add, let me just hide this. It's going to do this, which, is not bad, right? You do need to fine tune it a little bit, and it isn't compatible with all the effects. You'll notice that I had to turn it off for the ray trace engine, but it's kind of nice as an option. Do something like that. Yeah, exactly. And you can tweak it further. That way the whites get picked up, but that's what that is. And you can just remove an effect by double clicking. Okay, great. All right, we don't need that. Architectural, let's put on our 2-point, right? That way everything's straight. We're not going to notice too much of a difference because of the angle we're on, but remember, if I were doing something like that, it would be a big difference. So I'm just going to restore. Right now, this is called Photo 1, the image. I can actually just go up here and rename this to angled front elevation. And that way, when I render this out, it'll actually take that as a file name. So that'll save me a couple clicks, actually. Okay. We've got styrofoam. This is good, again, when it's early on and you just want to send like, hey, this is what the context looks like. This is what the model looks like. This is a good option, but don't need this. But it's important to point these things out. Orthographic view, these are kind of fun. Check this out. If I enable this, it's going to make it a 2D drawing. So now I actually have this cool like dollhouse look for an aerial view. Clients actually really like this because it shows, when it comes to complex roofs, right? It shows what's going on up here, shows the relationship of like the property to the context and everything. So this is great. You can also do this for like the front. And this kind of matches those drawings, those material drawings we were looking at early on, right? So you have that as an option. Some clients like it. It really depends on what they're using it for, right? But this is how you would do a materialized elevation, right? You don't even need to bring it into Photoshop. You could just do it all in Lumion. So that's super cool. Remove that. Okay, let's move on. Lighting. So again, we've got real skies. That's going to give us the HDRI. But then there's the sun effect. And the sun effect, you go here, is going to let you control the precision of the time of day, right? time of day, the heading and everything. So it's a little bit different where you've got one where it's the HDRI, which is handling the shading and the lighting, but then you can also customize it further with the sun effect, right? So you could do something like that if you want, right? So it's cool that you've got all these different options. I was happy with the HDRI, but again, if you want that like weather system we were using before to come through, that's how you do that with sun. So I'm going to disable that. Okay, cool. And I'm going to continue on here. If you want to control, the shadows, how dark they are, reflection, this we'll talk about later on, but this we don't need anymore. So you'll notice how it's turned off. This is because of ray tracing. Again, back in the day, right, in Lumion 12.5, when you had to build these effects stacks, you actually had to tell it what would be reflective or not, which was a huge pain in the butt because there are only so many planes you could select. So that's why it's nice that ray tracing is handling a lot of the global illumination and reflections for us. So I'm just going to turn that off. We'll talk about that more in the interior portion of the class. Same thing with like skylight, hyperlight. These are all kind of like, they're older effects. We actually don't need them if you're using ray trace, okay? Volumetric sunlight. This, depending on your preference, you might like this. You see how it's like adding the actual light in here, but it kind of makes everything look kind of like blurred out. And that's where this range is coming into play to kind of give it a threshold of when to kick in. I don't mind it. It's just like it adds too much like fog to the background, which isn't really what we want, but you can definitely play with it. It's good if you're doing like God rays and stuff like that, where you want to see the light coming through. That's when you would use that. But again, I don't like how it's like removing the sharpness from our image. So I'm going to turn that off. Okay, and then still thinking with that. So I'm going to turn that off. Okay, great. So now I'm going to go back. Sky and weather. Again, if you were using the dynamic system, you can customize the clouds, but since we're using HDRI, that's why we can't. Precipitation, if you want to do like snowy or rainy, that's where this is going to come in, right? So you can actually customize how much snow is on the project. If it's raining, if it's dry, if there's puddles and everything. Like this is crazy. I don't really play with this too much because clients usually like to see their projects like in the best light, like literally. So that's why I don't use this. But if you're doing a snowy scene, why not? So I'm going to remove that. Okay. This one might be kind of useful. Autumn colors. So some trees, if you want, you can actually tell them to be different colors. So I'm going to change my target layer because it was vegetation, because we're organized. Actually try and make them a different color. Look at that. So this is kind of cool because instead of us like having to pick autumn trees, you can actually have Lumion do that for you. So now this is kind of like fall and it's changing all the greens to be this color. So you can choose how much of variation there is. Saturated they are. You see that? That's super vibrant. It's desaturated. I think it's cool. Do I use it too often? Not. I think the green is totally fine, which is, the default. This usually is how I send the renders over, but it is cool that it actually supports that functionality. Okay, and what else? We talked about our camera settings. That's that lens flare again. There's camera aberrations. So watch this out. So this is kind of useful. You see how it looks like super warped. Cameras in general always have a little bit of it. It's just like an artifact from taking a photo. So having a little bit, totally safe, adds some realism because it's basically matching a photo. Animation, we'll talk about this in the animation portion. We've got more artistic settings. If you want watercolor or paintings, you could do that. And, these are some of the settings we were talking about before about sharpening, analog lab, and all that. Tools, this one's actually really useful. This will actually help upscale an image, so it won't render as long as needed. It'll actually just make it look higher res without that render time. So these right here, these are super useful when it comes to actually like hiding things. So layer visibility, you can tell it which layer should be on and off. And why would you use this? So you have design options, right? You only want design option 1 available, right? So that's why you would use this. since we have only 2 layers here, that's totally fine. I don't need that. Variation control. In a model, you can actually upload a variant of it. So let's say I've got this material option. I can actually go in and tell it, no, I actually want another version. So let me go here and switch to imported models. Right down here, that's the variation control. So if I wanted a different facade option where it's like gray or something, that's where this would come into play. And then I can have a gray option and a white option. And with that setting I was showing you, you can actually switch between the two. So that's kind of nice to have if you need that. So that's why it's asking for a target option, a target object, and then the variation. So you can tell it which one to choose. So that I actually use a lot because clients are always like, oh, we've got option A and option B. Can we see both of them? I'm going to turn that off. Okay. And then near clip plane. So you see how I've got this tree here? Let's say I didn't want it. That's going to chop it out of the way. So let me give you another example. See how it's removing anything that's near the camera? So that's what that's doing. Great. Awesome. And that's it. Those are the main effects that we'll use for exteriors, right? So I know it seems like a lot, but a lot of this is actually stylization, right? The core effect we need is just ray tracing, right? Ray tracing is going to give us high quality reflections, lighting, and everything. This is all just to make our life easier, right? Near clip plane to remove anything close to the camera. This to give the fringing around the edges. This is just artistic to make all the verticals straight. And these are all filter systems. But the nice thing is you can customize each view to have its own sort of setting. So I'm going to continue tweaking the settings a little bit more, and then let's do a render, and then we can move on to our interior project.